A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase.
Hello everybody, I'm in a bit of a mood this evening. I've spent all day, a day that hasn't seen a cloud, indoors doing my taxis. Now I've never had open heart surgery, but I'm going to assume that taxis is worse. Anyway, to cheer myself up, I've come out for what hopefully will be a nice golden hour and blue hour, and I was going to get some photos just prancing around on my bike, maybe with the bike lights and stuff. It might not work out, but I thought I'd come and try anyway. Before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the rule of thirds though, because I have a love-hate relationship with the rule of thirds, and I thought I'd talk about that a little bit today. Now the grid that you see on lots of cameras, I mean it's a setting in pretty much every camera available now. I have that set up pretty much all the time on my G9. I say pretty much all of the time, I can't remember the last time I turned it off. I'm not sure I'd have ever turned it off, so all of the time. And by and large, I find it quite a useful compositional tool. I do, however, have several problems with the rule of thirds. The first is with it being called a rule. Now, if you've watched this channel for a while, you'll probably know that I like to look at photography as like an art, a way of creative expression. And when you're trying to create things, the last thing you want is rules about how to do them. That stifles creativity, as far as I can tell. And yet, the very first thing you're taught about composition when you're learning photography is, well, something called a rule. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of that. And I think I could probably appoint about half of my gripe with the rule of thirds, with the fact that it's called a rule. If it was like the guide of thirds or something, I'd have much less of a problem with it, but I don't like the fact that it's called a rule. That's not the only thing I don't like about it though. It's also super ambiguous in my mind. So I could show you lots of relatively complex scenes, and I could argue for each of them I had in some way considered the rule of thirds, and you wouldn't really be able to argue back. Because if you've got a scene that has a certain level of complexity, you've got things in the foreground, things in the background, lots going on, then you'll always be able to argue that something lines up with one of the lines of thirds. So when you've got scenes of a certain level of complexity, this rule of thirds becomes a little bit pointless, really. Because like I said, anything can line up with those lines, and it doesn't necessarily help your composition. And the other thing I don't really like about the rule of thirds is that as well as being ambiguous, it's not sufficient. So if you were out taking photos, as I am now, and you were to just blindly line up one of your subjects with one of the lines in the rule of thirds, it doesn't necessarily make your photo any better. In fact, it can make it worse. So in summary, I don't like that it's called a rule, I don't like that it's ambiguous, and I also don't think it's very sufficient when it comes to a guide even of how to compose your photos. Basically, that's all the things I don't like about the rule of thirds. So there are some things I do like about it though, and there are lots of times when I actively try and take it into account when I'm taking photos, which I'll show you now as well. When I left home about an hour ago, there was a southerly breeze, probably about 3 or 4 miles an hour. Wonderful. There's now a northerly 15-mile-an-hour wind, and I've not come dressed for it. Look at these guys. What's up? Right, anyway, I'm getting distracted. Okay, so this is a scene currently being shot with my G9. Very nice scene. Look at that glow over there. Wonderful. Anyway, I use the rule of thirds typically to try and line up the horizon normally with one of the lines. So I'll either try and have the horizon on the bottom line if there's nothing particularly interesting in the land, or if the sky is not particularly interesting, I'll try and have the horizon on the top line. That is the basic premise of when I use the rule of thirds most. Right, I shall now demonstrate the second most common use for me of the rule of thirds with my bike. Just turn round. So when I've got a moving subject in my frame, I like to place that moving subject, in this case a bike, on or around the line, the rule of thirds line, that's closest to where they've come from. In other words, I've still got to travel through pretty much all of the frame, or 2/3 of the frame. And what that does for the viewer is lets them imagine the journey that the person or the subject is about to go on. If you move the subject to closer this line, I've got no idea if I'm anywhere near the line, but this line, I'll illuminate the line or something. Then as a viewer, I think you get a sense that you've sort of missed a lot of the action, because the subject is nearly all of the way through the frame. So yeah, that is the other use for the rule of thirds that I use. There are some others, but they're the two most common. Actually, I've just thought of another one. So rather than using those lines for horizons, sometimes I use each of those thirds as kind of zones, and I try and get everything that's of interest in a frame in one of those zones, because that can work really well with negative space, I find. So that's a third time or reason that I use the grid prominently in my compositions. Yeah. I'm completely missing golden hour here. I should really go and try and take some photos.
Don't need those on. Thought it was dark. I've been in the garden weeding. That's right, there is no limit to the excitement in my life. Taxes yesterday, weeding today. Rockstar. Anyway, last night's photo shoot didn't really go particularly well. I got one image and that was it, before I got too cold and too frustrated that I didn't have a full length tripod with me. If you've seen lots of these videos, you'll know that I hate tripods, and therefore that irks on two levels. But I'm going to go back tonight and have another go. Anyway, I wanted to quickly clarify the comments that I made on my bike last night about the movement in the frame with a few examples. So, as you can see in this one, I've put the car on the right of the frame and it's travelling towards the left of the frame, and therefore it's got the majority of its journey in the frame still to go, so that the viewer can kind of picture that. Here's another one. So the dog in this frame has still got most of the way to go through the frame. I mean, there's lots of dogs in this, but the one that's in focus, the one that's closest to the camera, that has still got most of its journey through the frame to go. Emily in this one has just turned a corner and is heading to the right, and she's still got most of the way to the right to go. This guy on Newborough Beach has still got most of his way to go through the frame towards the right. This guy surfing in Sri Lanka is a little bit too much towards the middle of the frame for my liking, but I was tracking and, well, clearly made a bit of a mistake. It's not the end of the world, I still like the photo. But yeah, that's just a few examples of how I try to use the rule of thirds to ensure that my subject has still got most of its journey in the frame ahead of it, because I find that helps with story when you've got subjects moving kind of parallel to your camera. Another thing that I thought I'd touch on quickly is about the horizon thing, about how I mostly try to place a horizon either on the bottom line of third or the top line of third. Line of third? Does that make sense? Anyway, I would say that I do that the majority of the time, but there are lots of instances where I don't, chiefly when there's a reflection involved. So when I've got any kind of reflection in my frame, more often than not, I'll put the horizon somewhere in the middle between the two lines of thirds, because a reflection by nature is like a mirror image. So it makes sense to have kind of a top and a bottom. And if you have the horizon in the middle, you get much more of a sense of that mirror. So whenever I've got a reflection, typically I like to have the horizon somewhere more like the middle than on one of the lines of thirds. Anyway, hopefully that was useful. Oh, I'll tell you one extra thing that I find useful as well when it comes to compositional tools. A lot of cameras, the same cameras typically that have the grid option, also have the option to put something right in the middle of the frame. And I would say that is as good, if not better, for composition than the grid, to be honest. Certainly for my photography, because if I find that I don't want to put a subject on one of the lines of thirds, for example, more often than not, I'll want to put it right in the middle of the frame. And it's not always easy to spot what is exactly right in the middle of the frame. So having a marker to point it out for you is a really big help. So yeah, my ideal sort of compositional tool setup is a marker right in the middle of the frame, as I've got on my G9, and a grid, as I've got on my G9. Although, with the grid, I reckon you could get rid of all the outside lines and just have a rectangle in the middle, because the rectangle has more than enough room to show where the horizon line should be, and typically you're not going to put your subject on one of the outer lines. So I don't think the outer lines are really necessary. I think you just have a rectangle, marker in the middle, bosh. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. Hopefully it was useful. Certainly more useful than any tutorial I'd do on taxes or weeding. A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've been using Squarespace for a long time now, and one of the tools that I use most is the analytics tool. So many of you won't know this, but in a past life, I worked as a marketer, or in marketing. I think that's what a marketer is. I don't even know what industry I was in. But yeah, I worked in marketing jobs, and therefore I worked a lot with things like Google Analytics and other analytics programs. I had to do exams in them. And that's great for when you really need to like dive into lots of material. But when you just want to look at stuff at a glance, Squarespace has its own analytics tool that enables you to look at things like traffic sources, geography, revenue, visitors, time on site, all that kind of stuff. And it's displayed really neatly so that you can just look at it of a morning when you're having your coffee without having to dive into all the detail and get lost in data. I find it really useful and I check it most days. This morning, for example, I was checking how my page from last week's video did, the storytelling image set. So if you're interested in Squarespace, go to squarespace.com to start a free trial. And if you're interested still after that, then go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. Big thanks to Squarespace. And of course, thank you to you for watching this video. I'll see you next week when hopefully I have a bit more luck with my images. And sadly, if I do, it will largely be to the credit of a tripod.